Good evening. Welcome. It's truly a pleasure to see all of you gathered here tonight for what promises to be a thoughtful and meaningful conversation. At a time when public discourse can so often feel hurried and polarized, gatherings like this remind us of the importance of slowing down, leaning in, and engaging with one another with curiosity and care. Institutions like Shepherd University, the Stubblefield Institute, and the Byrd Center play a vital role in creating these spaces, places where history, scholarship, and lived experience can intersect to deepen our collective understanding. My name is Ashley Hurst. I am the Executive Director of the Stubblefield Institute for Civil Political Communications at Shepherd University, a place where the spirit of inquiry is very much at the heart of the work being done here, a spirit that would not be present without visionary leadership. Before I introduce our program this evening, I'd like to take a moment to recognize two people who brought the vision of the Stubblefield Institute to fruition here at Shepherd. It is important to recognize these individuals now because today closes a chapter in the history of Shepherd University, of the Stubblefield Institute, and in these individuals' lives. First, it is my honor to recognize Shepherd University President Dr. Mary Hendricks for her instrumental role in founding the Stubblefield Institute for Civil Political Communications, along with Drs. Bonnie and Bill Stubblefield. Bill is seated with Dr. Hendricks tonight. President Hendricks recognized early on in her tenure that fostering civil-informed dialogue is not only an academic endeavor, but a civic responsibility. Through establishing the Institute in partnership with the Stubblefields, she has created a forum where complex and sometimes difficult conversations can take place with integrity, respect, and purpose. Over the last 7 years, her leadership has guided and inspired the important work we gather here to experience tonight. And I truly feel honored that she has chosen to spend her last evening as the 16th president of Shepherd University with us. Dr. Hendricks, will you please stand to be recognized? As if that weren't enough change at one time for Shepherd University and the Stubblefield Institute, I have another person I'd like to recognize. He couldn't be here this evening, but I'd like to draw your attention to him nonetheless. Dr. Ben Martz has been the Executive Director of the Shepherd Entrepreneurship and Research Corporation, better known as CERC, since its inception in 2018. Many of you may not be aware of what CERC does, but you probably are familiar with programs that have been started by Dr. Martz and CERC. These programs include the Stubblefield Institute and the Agricultural Innovation Center at Tabler Farm. Dr. Martz has spent the last 8 years generously giving of his business expertise to initiatives like these, so not only can they get started, but they can flourish. Having worked closely with him for the last few years, I can tell you that his guidance has been integral to the Institute's success, and his retirement is a loss that will be felt by the Institute, other CERC initiatives, and Shepherd University. We wish Dr. Martz well as he opens this next chapter. Now, as we look ahead to the 250th anniversary of the United States, we find ourselves in a moment that invites both celebration and reflection. Anniversaries of this magnitude are not just opportunities to commemorate milestones, they're invitations to ask deeper questions about who we are as a nation and how we have come to tell our story. What do we emphasize? Who gets included? And how are they portrayed? What do we leave unsaid? And who gets to decide? Tonight's program, Rewriting and Representation, How Do We Remember Our Nation's Past, is the second installment in this American Conversation series, a 2-part series of events designed to prepare us for the 250th anniversary by encouraging deeper, more reflective discussions about our national story. This series challenges us to think critically about history, not as a fixed narrative, but as something continually shaped by perspective, evidence, and voice. If you missed the first part of this series, Heroes and Villains, Reconciling the Legacy of Our Country's Historical Leaders, it is available on the Stubblefield Institute's YouTube channel. For me, the inspiration for tonight's topic comes from a personal experience earlier this year. It's not the first time I've experienced it, but most definitely the one with the greatest sheer size. In January, I took my children to see the video montage being projected on the Washington Monument to kick off the 250th celebration. I thought it would be a neat experience for my kids and an opportunity to visit with friends in DC. That night was a powerful presentation. But for me, it became more about what it didn't contain than what it did. As it unfolded, it became clear that the narrative was woefully incomplete. Entire groups of people and pivotal events, like the Civil War, were absent, leaving gaps in a story that is far more complex and inclusive than what was being shown. Our conversation walking away was less about being in awe of our nation and more about wondering who wrote the script and how they could have so blatantly skipped over so much of our nation's history and people. Tonight, we are fortunate to be joined by an exceptional panel who can shed light on how the narrative of our country gets written. I'm excited to introduce you now to our panelists. Starting on your far left, we have Cheyney McKnight, consultant to museums and historical sites and founder of Not Your Mama's History. Next to her, Megan Kate Nelson, historian and author of The Westerners, Mythmaking and Belonging on the American Frontier. Alan Spears, Senior Director of Cultural Resources with the National Park Conservation Association. And leading the conversation is Shepherd University's Dr. Jennifer Murray, whose scholarship and thoughtful moderation will help guide us through what we expect to be a rich and engaging conversation. My experience in January sparked the question at the center of tonight's conversation. How do we remember our nation's past and who controls the narrative? As we approach this significant anniversary, it is essential that we grapple with these questions honestly and thoughtfully. Thank you for being here and for your willingness to engage in this important dialogue. It's now my pleasure to turn it over to Dr. Jennifer Murray.
Thank you for that introduction, Ashley, and thank you, Dr. Hendricks, for spending your final night as Shepherd's president with us. This is an incredible opportunity to moderate this panel. Thank you to the Stubblefield Institute for facilitating this discussion. Thank you to my co-panelists. This has been an engaging conversation thus far, and I'm sure we'll have a dynamic hour and a half of conversation and discussion. And of course, thank you all for coming out and pausing your World Cup watching to have a conversation with us tonight. I'm confident this will be as stimulating as what you'll be watching on the pitch, I think. I'm not a soccer fan, so I think I got that right. It is a pitch, right? Okay, I'm just checking. All right. Very good. We're off to a good start. All right. All right. So what we've planned is we have some questions. We're going to go through in sequence one specific question to each, and we're going to start with Alan and sort of rotate then to the following two. And then we'll have an opportunity, I think, to bring some of the threads of those individual questions together. And then we have some more freewheeling questions, I think. And hopefully what we're planning is a pretty organic and capacious discussion about a very controversial moment in our national discourse. So, Alan, the first question is to you, please, as I'll read it. In his executive order, Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History, President Trump says that the sites under the National Park Service, such as Independence National Historical Park, have advanced ideology over history. From your perspective, as Senior Director of Cultural Resources at the National Parks Conservation Association, what do you see the role of our national parks and historic sites being in telling the story of the United States?
Great question. And I'm only supposed to say that to you, Admiral Stubblefield, but that was a great question, a good way to start us off. So I would start by saying I think the president's wrong. I think that the function of national parks, the parks that I grew up with, Harper's Ferry, Antietam, Gettysburg, and Petersburg in particular, have a responsibility on behalf of the American people to interpret our history, our shared national narrative at these places. And I think what's happened, especially with the Park Service, and this is what makes me so proud of the agency, is that over the last 25 to 30 years, they've gotten a lot better about incorporating the fullness of the American narrative at places like Antietam. And we've got a good representative here, my friend Dennis Frye, who helped bring about a better, deeper understanding that Civil War history, American history, is not always just about the guys on horseback with the swords, that it is about all of us, it is about our ancestors, and the contentious nature of that shared narrative that we all are a part of. And I think what's happened right now with some of the Restoring Truth and Sanity efforts is that they have mistaken making history more accurate, more inclusive, and more just for politicizing history. And I think the challenge is that when you are used to having something go your own way for generations and generations and generations, and when you don't quite understand that we were lied to about our history for 100 years, especially when it comes to race and the Civil War, that the first time you see somebody talking about, well, we need to add Harriet Tubman or Sojourner Truth, or the United States colored troops, or the issue of slavery as a root cause of the American Civil War, that sounds like a power grab. It isn't. It's just a leavening of the history to make it more accurate and more inclusive. So our national parks have been doing that. I think the president is going to suggest and has suggested that that is the woke behavior, that is something that we all need to fear, which is something that always amuses me. Because if you think about the history of this country, during the Second World War, we teamed up with our allies, we stood toe-to-toe against fascism, and we won. We did that. And this administration would have all of us believe that the fundamental values of our democratic society are going to be threatened by the interp and a National Park Service brochure? Don't believe the hype.
What I think will come out of the conversation tonight, and you have the bios in hand, I think, if you picked up the program, is that all three of the panelists have really eclectic backgrounds. So while we'll have some overlap, I think there will also maybe be some nuance in our discussion, which will be fun, right? This was all curated, but yet organic in the same way. So thank you for that thoughtful response, Alan. I look forward to following up with some of those threads. Cheyney, the next question to you, please, and I'll read this as we wrote it. We are familiar with some of the changes in the Trump government's purview. As someone who consults for private museums and historical sites, what changes have you witnessed in the last year and a half, please?
I'm saddened to say that I've seen a lot of changes, and I've seen a lot of obeying in advance. Instead of, there have been a lot of changes over my career. I've been in interpretation for 16 years so far. And over that time, I've seen a lot of changes. What I think are really, really good changes, very positive changes. A bit, Alan has spoken to that. But I have to say, in just 2 years, I've seen a lot of very quick reversals. So first things first, what we noticed right away was the canceling of a lot of grants. We saw people canceling invitations. And also, I have seen an uptick in harassing calls, emails, actually physical mail, which actually is, I was really shocked to get actual physical hate mail. It's like, wow, a lot of effort in the year 2026. And I've also seen, but at the same time, for me, it is also, I've been able to see the fight of many interpreters, historic sites, directors. I don't like to focus on the people who obeyed in advance. I like to focus on the people who dug in and said, I'm going to keep talking about this no matter what. We're going to keep interpreting it. I think it shows a lot of courage, especially for the people who got their marching orders and continued marching the other way. So that's what I'm seeing. And I would encourage everyone to pay attention to the people who are standing strong, and continue to interpret the full, complete story of our nation. Support those people, and please do not shed lights on those people, because if you remember, the nail that is sticking up gets hammered. So quietly support those people. Take a lesson from our study of from people who were aiding and abetting freedom seekers. You don't say, over here, look over here, these people are running to freedom, and you see how I'm helping them? Quietly help them. Don't shed a light. Shed help.
Thank you for that. I look forward to diving into some more of this, particularly since you're so much in the trenches of this conversation, more than I am in my particular position. So thank you for that. Megan, last but not least, of course, your kickoff question as we wrote it. Your latest book, The Westerners, Mythmaking and Belonging on the American Frontier, discusses how the portrayal of pioneers in the American West as dominated by white men, termed the frontier myth, originates as early as the 1800s. What changes made since January 2025 are top of mind for many of us, and what does your examination of myth-making in the American West reveal about the historical practice of interpreting history? Please.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I start the book, one of the big questions you always have as a writer, and I think also as an interpreter, is like, where do you start the story, right? How do you begin in the book? How do you bring your reader into this topic? And The Westerners begins with Frederick Jackson Turner. And we always joke in Western history that it's a book of U.S. Western history if it either begins or ends with Frederick Jackson Turner, because he's just everywhere. Like he just, he haunts us, and has been haunting us for 100 years. And I wanted to start with him as he was procrastinating and desperately finishing the Frontier thesis, which he presented at a historical conference as part of the World's Fair in 1893, because I wanted to show historians as people who are part of this process. So, we have public historians, we have interpreters, we have people on the ground who have direct contact with the public. And academic historians, I think, can sometimes seem very much at a far remove, that we are kind of separated from an audience by the books or readership, or, there's a distance there. And I think that's very true, but I think also historians sometimes get a pass for that. But Turner, gave this paper, which was really radical at the time, because he was suggesting that the root of the American character was not in European antecedents for American democracy. It was in the frontier experience of white families in covered wagons moving from east to west, conquering indigenous peoples, conquering the wilderness, and settling the West, and that this is a foundational kind of moment. And that was a really radical argument for him to be making at the time. But what it is, and if we're talking about kind of these sort of accusations that always get lobbed at historians, that you are woke, that you're politically correct, that was the kind of previous term for it, or revisionist, right? But it was actually Turner in 1893 who was the revisionist, because he was erasing so many communities of people who actually built the American West in the 19th century from that whole narrative of what it means to be an American, right? And he gave it the imprimatur of historical truth. And he shaped the way that Americans have learned and interpreted American Western history and also American history writ large for almost 100 years. It was not until the 1980s that this kind of group of historians called the New Western Historians started to push back against this image. But he's still really dominant. I mean, obviously, we're still grappling kind of with him. And his vision and the vision of the frontier and the pioneer is still with us in all different forms, which I'm sure we're going to talk about here later.
With those questions as a point of departure, is there anything that you would like to sort of respond to one another? We curated the questions specific to your own maybe background at this moment. Is there anything that we'd want to add to those initial kickoff questions?
Well, I mean, I can also say one of my previous books was on Yellowstone, and it came out on the 150th anniversary. And at that point, in 2022, Yellowstone National Park was doing a really good job of bringing in indigenous people and indigenous voices, which it had not done a very good job of before. And they had brought in the Apsalaki peoples, the Crow, and they had a lot of programming. And that effort was really kind of picking up steam. And I'm not sure what has happened to that programming now. I think it has mostly gone away. But this is, I mean, even at nature parks that are not explicitly, they're not battlefield parks or national historic sites, but meant to be sort of the grandness of nature, those parks still have a history. And they still have history that needs to be recognized. And they are under attack as well. I mean, the Trump administration is trying to get them to take down scientific plaques and placards, in addition to anything that mentions that this was and still is indigenous land, right? So I think in terms of national park sites and historic sites, they're still sites of contention in so many different ways about what gets included and what people find, what they think visitors will find to be important or meaningful to learn.
If I might, so it's a mess right now what's happening with truth and sanity and the removal of signage. Removal of signage about the Wabanaki people at Acadia National Park along with climate science signage. But the interesting thing that I'd want to share with folks now is there are a couple different ways that you can approach this issue of history censorship or erasure. One is you can take the signage down. You can prevent people from talking about slavery as a root cause of the American Civil War. You can prevent people from talking about civil rights. But the other way is, with regard to our national parks, you can just cut the budget and the staffing level. The National Park Service lost 25% of its staffing in 1 year, 2025. So you've got fewer people to process grants, you've got fewer people who can do interpretation, because unfortunately, the agency still does have a reputation as being the stewards of these large Western natural landscapes. And so when you've got a difficult budget and you are a Park Service manager, you have to make a decision. Do you have someone from facilities and maintenance who can keep the bathrooms clean and running, or do you hire an archaeologist? Or do you hire a historian? Do you make sure that your interpreters are going to training so that they can meet with their colleagues and learn best practices? Historiography is always changing. And so one of the ways that you can effectively disenfranchise an agency, which is meant to serve the public and be a true steward of our history, that shared national narrative I keep talking about, is you cut the budget and you cut the staffing levels. And that has a similar impact. And so these things, the National Parks Conservation Association is an advocacy organization. You can look us up, visit our website, www.npca.org. I said this last time when I was here a couple weeks ago at the Yale Public History Institute. You just have to be careful because we also share those initials with the National Police Canine Association. So you got to make sure you're on the right website. But we've got lots of information about the impact, and you are absolutely right. There are 433 units in the National Park System right now. Every single one has an obligation to protect and interpret and manage historic and cultural resources, even the large landscape parks. Moreover, what's important also to note about the National Park Service is all the programs that they run. National Register of Historic Places, National Historic Landmarks Program, National Historic Preservation Fund, National Heritage Areas, Japanese American Incarceration Sites Program, African American Civil Rights Network. These are all managed by the National Park Service, and unfortunately the way the staffing and the budget levels, they're being run all by the same 3 people at this point in time. And then you get folks like me in my job as an advocate, and I'm still not out of the business of trying to establish new national park sites because our history is not complete. And so we need to continue to talk about how we grow and expand that system so that we can continue to talk about all of the history and the narratives that we have. You know, there's a Flight 93 memorial in Pennsylvania where that plane went down, where the passengers took that plane down. And right up until September 10th, 2001, there was no need for that site. History changes. And the National Park Service is the agency that we have chartered with the responsibility, with the task, with the honor and the privilege of protecting and preserving these stories. And now we're treating them like a third-class agency. That needs to change.
Well, and Cheyney, as you were saying too, the wholesale destruction of the NEH and the NEA has taken so much funding away from historians and from public historians and all kinds of projects. By the way, we still don't know where all that Doge siphoned money is. Like, where did it go? Reflecting. That's right. The ballroom.
Was the mic on for that?
That's right, but that's how you do it. You starve it of money. And this is where, and you know, the NIH too, with scientific funding. You know, people can't do their research if they don't have money. They can't launch community projects. They can't, create a new textbook or a new kind of user interface or visitor interface at a park because there's no money to do it.
I also just real quick want to shed a light on the fact that a lot of National Park Service employees it's not just the erasure of funding, it's the constant kind of harassment of coming to your desk in the morning and worried about what type of emails they're going to get. Sometimes they get to their desk and they're told that they're laid off. And then in a few minutes, it's like, psych, nope, you still have a job. It's kind of where a memo will come down one day that you're no longer allowed to say this word, this word, this word. And then the next day, one of those words have been taken off the list. And then by next week, it's been added back on. And I think that this is actually on purpose to they want a lot of these people to quit. But a lot of them are still holding firm and continuing to come to work and interpret our history every single day to schools, to families, to groups from all over the world. And I want to make sure that we are remembering that. And when you come across these people, please be kind and gentle with our park employees.
So I have a context question. Historians like context. So teaching history or consuming history has always been politicized. And here I'm thinking, and I'm a Civil War historian, so here I'm thinking about the ways in which in the post-Civil War years, particularly during Reconstruction in the early 20th century, the United Daughters of the Confederacy had considerable power and sway over the writing of history textbooks in states of the former Confederacy. Move forward to the 20th century, I'm thinking the ways in which teachers were scrutinized, let's say, in the Cold War era with McCarthyism. So that teaching and presentation of history has always been politicized. I'm wondering if you could help us understand what is different about this particular moment, the the urgency, or what's different about the politicization of the interpretation of history or the consumption of history that might help us understand the particular peculiar moment that we're living in? Please.
I do not believe that it is vastly different. I think that it is very much, it is directly being spoken about right now, today. We also have to really be honest about how we as Americans memorialize and what we consider to be important. And it has largely been Eurocentric memorialization. I find that there are kind of three, I guess, pillars of this. Number one, it's a lot of intimidation. So when I'm thinking about Confederate statues, I grew up in Georgia. And so I grew up around a lot of Confederate statues, but I also grew up around bases that were named after Confederate generals and or streets and roads leading to these sites named after Confederate generals. And it is basically, it is intimidation and it is dominance. It is telling you that we don't care what you heard from the federal government, but right here, this is our place. Watch what you do. Watch what you say. Watch how you interact with us. So it is something that when I look at how from place to place, the statues we choose to put up, the names, when we change the names of certain places, of certain streets, think about what are we trying to communicate through that? And I find that they usually fall underneath these kind of pillars here.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I see that out there also, that the change is not as drastic as I think everyone thinks that it is. You know, they're like, oh, well, we've never seen this before. It's like, well, really? I think we have, in a lot of different ways. I mean, the thing that has been striking to me is how so much of it is coming from the top down, and so much of it is coming so overtly and so aggressively from the top down. Because if you're talking about the UDC, I mean, that's a community level organizing attempt. And a lot of the Confederate memorials and everything were privately funded, locally funded, right? And they were allowed to go up and they were in civic spaces, but you're not having, you know, the state of Georgia, the federal government saying, this is going here, right in the middle of your neighborhood. And it was really striking to me. I started writing The Westerners in the Biden administration, and I finished it in the Trump administration. And so you will see, like, my prologue and epilogue got much more aggressive about the political ramifications and the political applications of this image of the frontier and the pioneer. And it's because we started seeing very early on a lot of pioneer rhetoric, especially in Trump's RNC speech and his second inaugural. And then we started to see, and I think this is where it's a little bit different now, is just the expansive reach of social media and the amount of consumption of social media across the country. And so we started to see, and this all started happening actually last summer. Many of you are probably familiar with the John Gast lithograph, American Progress, from 1872. It's the giant floating white woman who symbolizes the United States and conquest and imperial desire, and she's moving across the landscape, dragging telegraph wire with her and leading trains, and they are literally chasing off the edge of the image indigenous peoples and bison, and it's called American Progress, right? And it was first produced actually as an illustration for Crofut's Guide, which was a tourist guide for the Transcontinental Railroad. This image showed up in a tweet from the Department of Homeland Security. And it said, "For heritage and homeland," which you may have also seen in a lot of the rhetoric. This is a neo-Nazi phrase that has been used to kind of galvanize that part of the Trump administration's base. That phrase was again used in an image that was tweeted out just a couple weeks later of a white pioneer family in a covered wagon with a new baby. And out the sort of opening, you could see this sort of unspoiled landscape for heritage and homeland. And then to cap it all off in January, there was an ICE recruitment poster that was a photograph. It's actually a modern photograph of a single cowboy riding through the landscape on the bottom. And then on the top, and this is all put in sepia tone as if it's an older 19th century photograph. But you know it's not, because above him is a stealth bomber that is flying, and it's an ICE recruitment poster. So, and they're urging you to join the fight for the homeland through this like rugged individualism of the American cowboy connected to the American military infrastructure, right? So this is where I'm seeing that this is kind of a, I don't know why it should seem startling at this point, but a different kind of politicization that is based in social media, meant to kind of provoke and galvanize, and coming directly from the administration.
Okay. So I need to out myself as the guy from the National Parks Conservation Association who in that horrible summer of 2020, COVID raging, Floyd had been murdered by the Minneapolis Police Department, and NPCA was getting calls from a lot of people to demand that the National Park Service remove Confederate statues from sites that are managed by the National Park Service. I'm the guy who wrote the policy for NPCA saying that we did not approve and we would not support for arbitrary and mandatory calls for the removal of those Confederate statues. And I'll tell you why. I'm not a fan of secession, not a fan necessarily of the Confederacy, but I do think in some instances, in many instances, those statues do have some inherent intrinsic historic value. And I'm just dumb enough to want the conversation, because I believe in the ability of National Park Service interpretive rangers to be there with tour groups and to be able to say, this thing was put here in 1916 or it was put here in 1963. Check the timeline on that. Hadn't been any fighting here at Gettysburg or Antietam or other places like that for a long time, so why are these coming in at this particular time? And how did that centennial of the American Civil War being impacted, because it was happening right in the middle of the civil rights movement, the modern civil rights movement, how did that impact these decisions as well? But I also have a differentiation between having the statue of Stonewall. Has anybody here seen the statue of Stonewall Jackson at Manassas National Battlefield? He looks like he just came from Gold's Gym. Even the horse has muscles. And so you think about Stonewall Jackson as being this bookish guy and an instructor at the academy doing artillery tactics and having students repeat lectures because he didn't like the way that they were talking about what he had instructed them. And now he's got all these rippling muscles. So there's challenges with the way that that was designed, but it's still on the battlefield. We can have conversations about that, right? We're Americans. We can walk, chew gum, and have difficult conversations at the same time. So I think the Park Service in these national parks that have Confederate monuments and statues, this is a place where we can open up conversations about who we are and where we've been and maybe where we're going. Now, if you have a Confederate statue in front of a courthouse, you guys rent the Ford F-150 pickup, I'll bring the tow rope. Here's the difference for me. At Gettysburg with the statue, the Virginia statue, the statue of Robert E. Lee, and at Manassas National Battlefield, the statue of Stonewall Jackson, no black person has ever had to walk past those statues to try to register to vote. It's different.
So partly I wonder if the American public can make distinctions or how nuanced some of their thinking is. And I'm going to share 2 statistics with you as a point of departure for conversation. And the historian's going to read math here, so here we go. 52% of the American people said they, quote, support efforts to preserve the legacy and the history of the Confederacy through public memorials and statues in their community. This comes from a 2024 poll, incidentally. So, one more time, 52% of Americans polled in 2024 said they, quote, support efforts to preserve the legacy and history of the Confederacy through public memorials and statues in their community. Same poll, 90% of the respondents said that they support efforts to tell the truth about the history of slavery, violence, and discrimination against minorities in their community. 90%, same poll, says they support the efforts to tell the history of slavery, violence, and discrimination in their community. So, are these results contradictory? Can 2 things be true at the same time? And how does this help us understand what our role as historians, academic or public historians, are in how we should present history? How do we reconcile being okay with the Confederacy in our public spaces, and then at the same time overwhelmingly want an honest conversation about the history of slavery? Because you cannot divorce those 2. You cannot divorce enslavement from the Confederacy. That's the foundation of it, as Alexander Stevens told us in his Cornerstone speech. So can you help us understand or thread that needle? This is my favorite part of moderating discussion. Is like they ask the question and then the awkward pause.
Oh my gosh,
we all kind of
the
look.
mic doesn't
Who's
work
taking
anymore.
it first? Right. They cut you off at the back. Right, very nice.
Is this thing on?
Right. Come on, Alan.
is this
Pick
thing
it up. Megan, there we go. Nice, thank you.
Well, so my opinion is really masterful interpretation can get us close. And so I'm sorry to do this, but it's like Dennis Frye is in the audience. It's just like one of the best people out there in terms of, sharing the full breadth and depth of American history. And your colleague, D. Scott Hartwig, who has written 2 fantastic books about the Battle of Antietam. I knew Scott from his time at Gettysburg. And I know other National Park Service rangers who, it's not just a job for them, it is a calling, it is this passion that they have for getting deep into the weeds on this history and connecting all these dots that the truth and sanity people would have us just dismiss because we don't like complexity. But as an honorary black person, I can tell you we complicate American history. That's just what we do. That's how we roll. And I think it's better history because we're able to complicate it. Women do the same thing, folks from the LGBTQ communities, labor, right? We complicate these stories in ways that are actually quite wonderful. And I think that what has to happen at this point in time is a better understanding of the narrative and a better opportunity for all of us to understand that, an example that I would use, and I'll try to land this as quickly as I can, the 11th Mississippi Infantry Regiment at Gettysburg. They are on the far left of Pickett's and Pettigrew's charge on Friday, July 3rd, 1863. They can't see the copse of trees in front of them, so what do they focus on? The White House and barn of Abraham Bryan, a free African-American man with a wife who liberated herself on the Underground Railroad. The Bryan family had long since gotten out of Gettysburg, which was, by the way, a stop on the Underground Railroad, about 200 African-Americans living in Adams County at that point in time. So they were gone, but the 11th Mississippi Infantry Regiment used that White House and barn as their guide on point in their assault. They go across an open mile of hell, they get all shot to pieces, and they get to the Abraham Bryan barn and they turn around and there's nobody behind them, no supports. So the story on the 11th Mississippi Infantry Regiment is that those who weren't wounded or captured walked backwards across that battlefield because they didn't want to take the chance in being shot in the back and being taken for cowards. I'm fine with saying that that's a singular instance of valor. And I'm also fine for saying that they did that service in the service of one of the most corrupt causes in human history. That's my opinion. And I think we can talk about all those things, but we've got to have the ability to have these challenging... Listen, we need all to be at the graduate level, right? This is a participatory democracy. So if you're going to participate, you need to be informed, which, by the way, is actually what woke means. It just means being informed and being aware and being a participant in your own country, knowing about your constitution, knowing about the laws, knowing about the history. So let's all be a little bit more woke. Let's all be a little bit more informed. And let's not be afraid to have these ideas that challenge themselves. Good history is a little bit like a roller derby. You're going to have some things that smash into each other. And then you get up and you keep going. That's the whole purpose, and I think that's one of the things wonderful about being here at the Stubblefield Institute, is to not be afraid of having these conversations. You know, we can be in contention with each other ideologically, but not battle it out. We don't have to fight people. We don't have to have is the Stubblefield Institute at some point in time, so we've done one thing 2 weeks ago, we've got the event tonight. Are you guys going to have a UFC cage fight next week? We don't have to go in that direction.
It's my job to have these very difficult conversations with people from across America and across the world. And one thing that I know is that the majority of Americans in general want to have a quote unquote equal sides conversation. But the reality is, these two narratives are not, or these narratives are not starting from the same starting point. So for example, we've had this quote unquote not lost cause narrative being kind of at the forefront for a very long time. And it's really been maybe the past 15 years. Of course, there have been sites that have been talking about the full story of enslavement in this country, as well as the causes of the Civil War for a very long time. But I'm talking about, in general, the real push has been about 15 years, 5 to 15 years. And it really seems like we're kind of going back a bit, but that's not the case.
Well, one of the things, and this is a problem. This is why I didn't do very well on the GRE logic part of the test, because I'd be like, but why doesn't Susie want to be on the train with Bob? What's the story there? Because I want to know how respondents interpreted that first one about, are you in favor of remembering the history and the legacy? Okay, so I'm in favor of remembering the history and the legacy of the Confederacy. If we build a Confederate memorial that is about what the Confederacy stood for, really, right? And I think we can learn from something like the Memorial to the Holocaust in Berlin. It's not honoring the Nazis, right? It is depicting the slaughter of so many people in a really sorrowful and serious and meaningful way. And so the way that those two things can exist is, first of all, if people were like, well, yes, we need to remember the Confederacy because we need to remember, we're not going to erase that part of our history, right? We need to remember what they stood for and what they were actually fighting for. And we need to recognize that, and we need to have that front and center. But that doesn't mean we're going to honor it, right? We're not going to call it brave. We're not going to call it courageous. We are going to call it what it was, which was a defense of a system that gave white people power. And so then I could see it okay, then it can sit side by side with the desire to recognize the reality of slavery and enslavement. But I'm also, and then I'm also kind of, my skeptical side too is sort of did the respondents remember what the Confederacy was from their high school classes? Because I think we need to remember also that people who tend to show up at historic sites and people who tend to go to these places. My father was a he had a master's in history, and he's a huge history nerd. And we went on driving trips across the country and stopped at every single historical marker and every single park site because he was into history, right? But a lot of people aren't. And so their history education ends on certain matters. Sometimes because like Jen and I were talking, like I grew up in Colorado. I never learned that Colorado soldiers took part in military engagements in New Mexico during the Civil War to push the Confederates back. I had no idea because we did Colorado history when we were like in 6th grade and never again, right? And the nature of our education system, K through 12, is limited by time and by resources and by the lack of respect that this country gives to teachers at any level. So, you know, how to really interpret that data is, I don't know, I think it's a little bit up for grabs. But I am very much in favor, like I haven't seen it in person yet. I really want to before it kind of disappears. But the monuments exhibit, where artists have taken Confederate monuments and other symbols of the Confederacy and slavery in the South and have reworked them. And it is, I've seen photographs and it just looks phenomenal. And that's the kind of, I think, monumental landscape that has the most meaning, because there's not always going to be a great interpreter, right? There's not always going to be someone who's like there, like you are, Cheyney, saying, look at these people, look at who they are, let's name them and understand their experience. And so, you know, to have some kind of either monumental landscape or some sort of, I mean, I love the kind of guerrilla history that the people of Philadelphia took into their own hands when they took those placards down at Washington's house, right? They put up their own, you know, flyers with all sorts of more information than had even been, you know, used on the previous ones. And like that kind of thing, I think is absolutely necessary, especially now.
And I think that, I'm sorry, you all, I'm having challenges with allergies. So if I cough, I'm so sorry. I think when I am at historic sites, everyone wants to have a very equal interpretation. And I don't know what many people exactly think what an equal interpretation is. I think what people want us to go around, kind of like if there was a activity a while ago that said, where people would say, in the circle, we don't judge, and they say something that they did really horrible. And I think that they're anticipating that I'm going to say, these are the good things white people did and the bad things white people did. And these are the good things Black people did, and these are the bad things. And these are the good things Indigenous people did and the bad things. And I think when a lot of Americans are saying we want equal treatment of stories to kind of something in that, when I speak to people and ask them, what do you mean about having an equal story all the way around? That's kind of what I'm getting from people. But I'm not going to do that. When I'm interpreting at historic sites, I'm going to tell the full narrative. And I have to say this, that there are a lot of sites that said, we are not getting rid of our Confederate monuments, and I completely understand that. But then I'm going to need some of the best interpretation I've ever seen in my life, okay? If I'm looking at, you know, a buff Gold's Gem stone wall, I'm going to need to see some of the best interpretation of my lifetime. Sometimes I get that, but then other times I don't. And I'm like, why am I looking at this now? And I don't have the full context. The reality is every site everywhere is not going to have appropriate context. And if we're not going to have appropriate context, whether it should be with signage as well as people. So that's kind of where I am in understanding when people are saying, I want both to learn about the Confederacy and I want the monuments, and I want to talk about slavery as well. And everyone doesn't have a PhD in African American studies. So it's us to provide the context, or us to put the context, put these monuments into context.
If I can pick up on that, and thank you. You know, you talk about the notion of maybe equal footing. Our history doesn't start in exactly the same place. And I've often imagined kind of history and interpretation and historiography in this country is people are in an arena, and you see at the end of a marathon runners coming in. And the black folks are not in the stadium yet, and the other folks are already making their third victory lap. There's a reason for that. And that reason is very personal for me, because I grew up in Washington, D.C., and I never wanted to be Frederick Douglass when I was a kid. You look at photographs of Frederick Douglass, he doesn't have a gun, he wasn't riding on a horse. And if you grow up with John Wayne movies, as I did, I always wanted to be Tyree. In every Western movie that John Wayne ever made, there was always some ex-Confederate who was now with the Union or the United States military, and he was always a scout. And Tyree would always have this wonderful Southern accent, and Tyree would get down off his horse and put one ear down to the ground and go, "5 Arica were here 2 weeks ago. One of them was left-handed." And then get back on the horse, and they'd ride off and find, you know. And that's who I wanted to be. And so the first couple of years I went to Gettysburg National Military Park, I was just in love with the place as a 10-year-old kid is going to be in love with a battlefield. There's cannons all over the place. What are you not going to love about that? But then the story had to catch up to me that, you know, if you were looking at the history of the 11th Mississippi Infantry Regiment or James Longstreet or Robert E. Lee, and there has to be a conversation at some point in time about what those people were fighting for. And I think there was a moment in my life when I kind of stepped away from the national parks, but then went back. And this is what I mean, and I take your point, and it's one of the ways that I come up short in my argument and my reasoning. So I appreciate having that brought up. But I've also seen what happens when you have that kind of interpretation, and especially from the Park Service. There's a ranger, Terry Latcher, who used to work at Gettysburg. I don't think she's still there. But I took a tour with Terry at one point in time, and the Park Service was trying to develop this seamless interpretation between the battlefield and the town of Gettysburg. One of the ways they did that was having rangers go out into Gettysburg and to share with visitors the African-American experience in the town of Gettysburg. And we got a tour from Terry that was actually crackerjacking, just first rate. And so I began to see that the National Park Service was not about the guys on horseback with the swords or the buff general. Irvin McDowell, by the way, not so buff. But the idea is that with good when it's there, when you haven't cut the staffing by 25% and cut the budget by however many percentage points, you actually have an opportunity to see all of these different elements. And I think that's the beautiful thing about what national parks are able to do at their best. But unfortunately, right now, they're nowhere near their best. But that's not because of the men and women who work in the National Park Service. It's because of the direction that they're getting from the President and the Secretary of the Interior.
So, of course, I like that so much of this conversation centers on the Civil War, not just because I'm the director of the Civil War Center, although that's a reason, of course, but because the Civil War is our nation's most defining epic. The American Civil War is our nation's most important singular event. It is fundamentally transformative of our political institutions, our culture, and our society. And you were talking about, both of you, in fact, made references to Gettysburg. And when the museum opened there in 2008, that pushed the new interpretation that moved Gettysburg beyond like the soldiers and the generals' stories, it was wildly controversial. And there were leading people who called the interpretation of slavery or the inclusion of a discussion of slavery at Gettysburg a, quote, cosmic threat. Remember the big controversy about this? So what is it about having those two narratives live simultaneously, your 11th Mississippi story, that makes Americans so profoundly uncomfortable? What is it about the Civil War? Is it the Robert Penn Warren quote that it's our felt history that makes that moment in time much more explosive and volatile? I mean, what is it about that particular moment, and why and how might we do better as academic historians and public historians and consumers of history? And that's like 5
Yes.
disconnected
Thank you for that.
questions into one. So this is my role
Yeah.
as moderator, right? Am I
That's
am I
right.
doing okay? This is good there, right? So, and any of those parts, please.
Well, now I got distracted, and what was I going to say? I was all ready.
Gettysburg.
52% of 97%.
Oh! No.
Stonewall Jackson on My Little Pony.
Oh, man. Oh, I know what I was going to say. Okay, I've thought of it. Excellent. Disaster averted. People like simple narratives. Simple narratives are compelling. And this is why the frontier myth is still with us, because it is linear. It is simple. When you actually map the routes that so many of the West's actual communities took, it looks like a crazed spider web. It does not look like a single line of railroad track, which is how it is always depicted. And I think this is the case in so many of our national narratives that have been embraced and usually created by white Easterners, bolstered by politicians and newspapers and the art world, that the simplest narrative is the one that sticks. And when you have complexity, when you have contradiction, I mean, people, when they realized that 19th century Americans could be both abolitionists and call for the quote unquote extermination of Native people, like you can see their heads explode, right? Like, but that's not consistent, that's contradictory. And yet, right? And it's very hard. I would think, I've never done interpretation at a site before, but I just know from writing history, it's really hard to write a compelling narrative that has so much complexity and contradiction. Because storytelling, and I think this is, one of the questions, that we've been thinking about is, how do you, kind of effectively convey these important issues? And one of those ways is storytelling. And this is why people like going to historic sites, and they like the work that you do, and they like the, I always hear about visitors to the Holocaust Museum because you go in and you get the ID of the person, right? And so there's a person and a story that you are following. It's not just a timeline or a list of facts or something like that. And so I think people are just, they are drawn to and compelled by the simplest of stories. And complexity makes them deeply uncomfortable because of that.
I believe that we have all built our identities and who we are based off of the stories that our families told us, from our earliest trips to museums, the school plays we participated in, our earliest narratives from our teachers. It is all the basis of who we are today. And I find that sometimes people get extremely angry with me. So years ago, I started using the stages of grief to kind of map out how my interactions were with people, how my interactions with people were going when talking about enslavement. And it has really helped me to understand how people are doing, because many people are going through grief. To understand the reality of how much we were lied to. We all were lied to in school about so partly the founding of our country, the basis of our economic power, you name it. There have been large holes in our education. And to be an interpreter and giving people information And also primary documents. Everything I tell people, I usually have a QR code in my pocket that I pull out and say, hey, I understand, because many people do challenge me all the time, and I understand that. Here's a QR code. And it is watching people go through grief. So I understand that in one visit, I am not going to get someone from anger to acceptance in one visit, or from grief to acceptance in one visit. But if I can move people along from one stage to the next, I understand that I have done something, and it's measurable, because sometimes people really, you can see it in people's faces, especially like in New York State. A lot of people did not know that there was slavery in New York. I would say now, and we just seen over the just 5-10 years, most New Yorkers now know there was slavery in New York. Before then, they did not. So I'm sitting in real time watching people realize that there was a lot of slavery in New York City. It was second in slave owners to Charleston. That's how much slavery was going on in New York City. And so we have to accept that talking to people about history is going to get emotional reactions, and it should, because this is who we are. This is our history. History brought us here today. It is who we are, and it is personal, it is emotional. And if people weren't getting emotional, then I would question if they were a spy. So I think we have to be more equipped to manage people and their emotions and be okay with that. I think on some levels, people just want people to hear history and be like, yep, that sounds about right. Great. Now I'm off. But learning how within your interpretation, giving it time to breathe, giving people time to breathe, and being okay that some people will leave angry, some people will leave sad, some people will leave even destroyed. But providing them with more reading material for later, information, resources before they leave, is very important.
So Cheyney, I want to echo what you said. We've all been lied to. And that sounds like a really harsh accusation. What do you mean we've been lied to? And if you go back to kind of the start of the history of the founding Western establishment in North America, none of the European Christian powers that were engaged in the African slave trade could square the abomination that was slavery with their religious beliefs and practices. Couldn't do it. But they couldn't cut loose of those profits. The Dutch have 3-masted sailing ships with 3 levels of guns. We need them too, England would say, or France would say. So you need that sugar and that rum. You needed enslaved labor and all the horrors that slavery brought. But the way that you square that circle is you create a philosophy of white supremacy and black subordination that makes it okay to whip people, to kidnap people, to work them from sunup until sundown, to separate families. And you create a philosophy that suggests that black people don't like education, that we are inured to pain, that we don't express love in the same way, that we hate education. And when you roll out a philosophy like that for 5 years, 10 years, 250 years, you get to a point where you can have someone who's got a police officer's knee on their neck for 8 minutes choking the life out of them. This is us. This is us. It's raising the flag on Iwo Jima, and it's George Floyd. This is us. And so I think the idea, from my perspective, is in defense of our national parks and the history that they maintain and protect and preserve, and what folks here at the Stubblefield Institute and at Shepherd University are trying to do, it seems, is to try to make sure that we are in a place where we can have those conflicts where we can have people like Cheyney, who gets people together, and you take them through those stages of grief for history, but you remove the lie. There is a quote from James Baldwin that I'm going to butcher, but he says that at some point in time, I think he was writing in the 1960s, it might have been the 1970s, that in this country, the United States of America, we use history and we use language to let the sleeper sleep and to cover the sleeper up and not wake them up. And again, we're going back to that notion of woke. And we're at a point right now where the fissures in this country, the friction that we're seeing, the separation that we're seeing, is encouraging all of us to not trust anyone else, to hate people if they have a different opinion, to hate people if they have a different hairstyle. And I think the one way that we can push back effectively against that, fight back, literally and figuratively, is by getting rid of the lies. And history is a really good place to start, because I think once you move through those lies, and we are still in a contentious way. I'm writing an essay right now about, in response to Wallace Stegner's quote, "Are national parks America's best idea?" My response is no, they're not. I spent the last 30 years advocating for national parks. I will fight till I drop dead for national parks. They're not America's best idea. And if you have an NPS visitor center that's plopped down on your ancestral homeland, they're certainly not America's best idea. If you have dedicated your life to the preservation of African American history, but you watched NPS people take down those plaques about those 9 enslaved people that George Washington brought with him from Mount Vernon to Philadelphia in the 1790s, definitely not America's best idea. If you are part of the LGBTQ community and you've seen the words transgender scrubbed from National Park Service interpretation, certainly not America's best idea. But they are worthy. But we got to get rid of the lies. We have to get rid of the lies, and history is a great place to start that process and to work our way through that, so that ultimately we can pull ourselves together and heal a little bit. But that's got to come through understanding all of our stories, all of our stories.
So, I appreciate that thought so much, and I want to try to get one last question in that maybe ties a few of these threads together. We're talking about lies. We're talking about myth-making. We've talked a little bit about the consumption of history. Americans love history, right? Our educational attainment is at an all-time high. 35% of Americans have a bachelor's degree. But we don't consume it in the academy. I tell my students this all the time, like, you're sitting in a history class, you are an exception, right? You consume your history in all these other places. It's through podcasts, it's through films, it's through historic sites, not reading books by academics, it seems, any longer, but you get history. I don't know why I pointed at you. I should have pointed at myself. I'm sorry about that. This is a comment to me, not to you. I need a new career, evidently. So we've democratized history, which is great, right? History is accessible to us all. But at the same time, anybody with an iPhone and a podcast is a historian, right? And there's so much bad history out there. I spent 11 years earning a history degree. I should have just bought an iPhone. I would have been set so much earlier. I did the right way.
It's also cheaper.
Indeed. It's very, very good. So we've democratized history, which in theory should make us all smarter, right? But it's not, because there is so much bad history out there. Not what we are doing, of course, but in any other venue. So my question, and maybe I'd like to hear from all three of you, is how do we combat against that, right? What are some useful skills that we can do better as we've democratized history, and has podcasting and these other venues actually helped us thread this nuance of complex history that we need to be good stewards of our nation's past? All three of you, please.
If I could start, and then I'll turn it over to you guys to clean it up. I don't know if anybody remembers, like, the late 1990s when we started getting poetry slams. And it was the democratization of poetry, because up until like 1997, if you wanted to read your poetry, if you had written anything, whether it was good or bad or indifferent, you had to apply to like the local used bookstore, where they only had 4 readings every 7 years. And then we got poetry readings at like every Starbucks and every Barnes & Noble, and it was some crappy stuff that was being... but it was a democratization of, literature and poetry. So sometimes you gotta get some of the... you have to let the tree run the sap in order to get the syrup or something like that. I don't know. I said that once in Vermont. People applauded. Clearly not working here in Shepherd.
You need your coal rub.
But yeah, so my answer to that is that I think I was in an Uber going back from a conference in Atlanta and had an African-American driver who asked me what I did for a living. I told him I worked on national parks, and he sort of got that weird look. He's like, do you guys use eminent domain to take people's homes to create national park sites? I was like, nope, but I know where this conversation is going. And so we went on another mile, and then the brother looked in the rearview mirror and he said, you know, I got a podcast I could recommend for you. And he gave me the name, and he said the reason why he liked this podcast is because this was a black scholar of African-American history who was proving with every podcast that the African slave trade had never happened. And the one thing that was his main point of contention about the African slave trade never happening is if millions of Africans were kidnapped and brought over to this country, where are the ships that brought them? So at this point in time, we're still about 5 miles from the airport. And I wanted to get home, so I'm in the back going, okay, yeah, right. Okay. Do you know how many aircraft carriers that were made out of steel that this country had in the Second World War? Do you know how many are left right now? None. And so you are right. There is a great deal of bad history out there, but that's why I'm throwing in my lot with the National Park Service. And maybe the thing is that we replenish that 25% drop in staffing levels, and we get them the budgets out of Congress, the administration and OMB doesn't screw around with them anymore, and we build back better to a point where the National Park Service has a bunch of podcasts. And they're bringing on people like us, and maybe people from the Stubblefield Institute to get rid of the lies. I dream, I hope. I hope.
I think the one thing I'm choosing to focus on in my education, primarily of the young folks, is to develop a curiosity of everything in them. There's no way for us to filter everything. And I don't think we should be able to choose within reason who gets a microphone and who doesn't. I think it is our job as parents, educators, adults in society, interpreters, directors, to teach them curiosity. So asking simple things like, look at this sign from America 250th. Why would they say this exactly like this? How do you think they chose the people to put in this picture? Why did they choose this particular image to put on this poster? It doesn't mean not passing judgment, but just instilling that curiosity so they can ask these questions and be that annoying kid that keeps asking why. It's kind of backfired on me because my nieces and nephews now, they sound like little birds. Why? But I'm so proud of them because I know that someone's not just going to say something to them and they're not just going to say, oh, okay, cool. They're going to ask questions. I'm sure in the future their ideas of things may differ from mine, and I have to be at peace with that because I instilled in them a sense of curiosity, but also making up their own minds based off of the evidence they have acquired, based off of what they have learned, to kind of draw the line of this is what I believe, and what you're telling me does not align with the evidence that I've come across and how I've chosen to interpret that evidence. And so any type of wind isn't just going to come through and sway them. So that's one thing that I would hope in the future, young folks, we really need to teach them how to look at propaganda, because propaganda is everywhere. I know I develop propaganda. I mean, like, I choose to interpret history a certain way. And so in a way, I develop propaganda, because I agree with my interpretation of history, other people may not. But I hope that whenever someone comes to one of my interpretations, they're asking me questions. They're like, why did you choose to interpret this particular painting and not that painting in the gallery? I love it when families ask me those questions. And I hope we get more of that in the future from young folks.
Yeah, and I think that what young kids are doing now, there was a very interesting interview with Jonathan Karp, who was the previous president of Simon & Schuster. And someone asked him, are you really worried about AI and what it's going to do to book publishing? And he said, I'm not worried about AI. I'm worried that the reading rates of middle school kids are plummeting. And what that means is that those kids are going to grow up and they're not going to be the readers and the book buyers that the earlier generations were. That is a huge problem. So how do you keep kids curious in this world we have now, where everything they see is created by an algorithm? Right? Like, they're not actually they might be thinking they're searching for it themselves, but it's actually not. They're being directed to certain things. And what I've always thought about technology and social media is that these are tools. And they are, I'm not going to say they're not inherently bad, because I think actually some of them are inherently bad, but the way that people use them really matters. And so, like, this idea that, like NPS can expand all of their kind of communications into all of these different fields, and we can do videos, and we can have a YouTube channel, and we can, convey history in these ways. And I think historians need to do a much better job of that. There's a real bias and a scorn among academics about social media and being on social media, and they hate it, and they don't want to be on it, and they only go on it if they have a book to promote. But there, Jen knows.
What are you looking at me now for?
And I know, shots fired over the bow. But there's a kind of way in which historians have been siloing themselves in academia. And they do it through this kind of scorn for social media and scorn for a more kind of reaching out and spending real time and effort and energy kind of stoking that curiosity in different formats. Also, for the most part, most historians are writing for each other and not for a broader public. And they are not storytelling, even though then they get in the classroom and they do a much better job of that, right? But with their books and with their research, it's not getting out. I mean, this is the thing, like for 40 years, more than 40 years, U.S. Western historians have been producing amazing research on indigenous history, on Latinx history, on borderlands, on all kinds of environmental histories of the West that completely blow up the frontier myth. And yet, Yellowstone and all of its spin-offs, still just huge market share on TV, right? And people love it. And it is still with us in so many different forms, right? And people are still kind of buying into these images, even though that all that research is out there. But they're only writing it for each other. And so historians have to do a much better job. I would love it if people started writing books not for themselves, but for readers, readers beyond their tenure committee, right? And that needs to be done. I mean, I think academic historians have, I know they have a lot of jobs and they're besieged right now, and so I feel kind of badly. But I still think there is so much more that they could do with the tools that we have available now that we did not have even like 10 years ago, really. But it really is kind of storytelling, and I think because when people read about people, they develop empathy, right? Like there's a woman in my book named Ella Watson who comes from Canada, ends up in Wyoming, has dreams of becoming a cattle queen. And she files for land under the Homestead Act. She buys her first kind of small, scraggly cattle herd, and she files for her brand. And then she comes to the attention of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association, which is basically the Wyoming mob, right? At this point in the book, my father called me, and he said, "What are you going to do to Ella Watson?" And I was like, I am not doing anything to Ella Watson. It's the mob that's going to do something. And when he got to the chapter where they did something, my mother texted me and said, "You have broken your father's heart." And I felt kind of bad, but then I also was like, yes. Because he was empathizing with her, with this woman from the past who he did not know, but he was identifying with her dreams. He was identifying with her kind of spirit and her attitude. And I think that when you create empathy, I think that it takes people out of themselves, right? And we don't do enough of that in the historical profession. I think also because historians also, they have a lot of scorn for social media and they have a lot of scorn for emotion and creating emotion through writing or talking about emotion. You know, they get very uncomfortable, very squirrely, right? Because historians are supposed to be objective. We're supposed to stand at a remove and not talk about any of that stuff. But I think these are the essential things to creating interest and empathy and curiosity and really kind of firing up, especially kids, but also I think adults' imaginations and their engagement with the reality of history.
Just one thing, I just want to say more collaborations between historians, artists, historians, and interpreters, and anyone in any type of creative field, because some historians, that's not their jam, their research side and writing, but I think so much can be. I've worked with a lot of historians, and I would not be here today without the relationships I have with historians who have been overly generous with their research, with their writing, sending me books for free, especially as a young interpreter who had just a suitcase to her name. So I had a suitcase to my name and a backpack full of books from historians. And so more collaborations between the two.
What a privileged position we are in to be stewards of our nation's past. My panelists here, thank you all very much for joining me tonight. Cheyney, Megan, and Alan, it has been a wonderful privilege. Very nice. Thank you for such a dynamic conversation tonight that we've had. Thank you to the Stubblefield Institute for hosting us, and thank all of you for coming out and sharing your time with us tonight. Hopefully we've given you something to think about and ruminate upon. So thank you all very much. Ashley, I'll turn it over to you for some final comments.
And let us not forget to thank Dr. Jennifer Murray. On behalf of the Stubblefield Institute and Shepherd University, I certainly want to thank our panelists for an interesting and engaging conversation tonight that I know we will all take pieces home and to conversations with others in the days to come. As we bring tonight's program to a close, I want to take a moment to reflect, though, on what we've shared together tonight. We began this evening with questions, and we got more questions, but we've explored memory, representation, and what shapes the stories we tell about our nation's past. While we may not leave with definitive answers, though I certainly think they've given us a lot of tangible things that we can do in the months ahead, I hope that we're leaving with something even more valuable. A deeper sense of curiosity, a willingness to listen more closely, and a commitment to engage more thoughtfully with the histories and more than just our own history or your family's history, but the beautiful and sometimes painful diversity of histories that surround us. What we've heard tonight reminds us that history is not static. It's not a finished story etched in stone, but an ongoing process of interpretation, one that requires us to revisit, to question, and sometimes to expand what we thought we understood. And that act of remembering is in many ways an act of responsibility. As we look ahead to the 250th anniversary of the United States founding, which is just a few days away, we are invited not only to celebrate, but to reflect honestly on the fullness of our shared past, the triumphs and the struggles, the voices long elevated, and those too often left out. If we are to move forward as a stronger and more inclusive society, we must be willing to make space for all of those stories. I want to extend once again my sincere thanks to our outstanding panelists for their insight, their candor, and your willingness to challenge us, and to Dr. Murray for guiding this conversation with such care and thoughtfulness. Finally, thank you all for being here, for showing up, for leaning in, and for engaging in a kind of civil, meaningful dialogue that is really at the heart of the Stubblefield Institute's mission. We hope this conversation continues beyond tonight with your colleagues, your families, and your communities. If you're interested in finding out what the Stubblefield Institute will be talking about next, please follow us on social media or check out our website. We are excited to share that our next event will move us from a discussion of the past to a conversation about the future. On July 21st at the Beckley-Raleigh County Convention Center, we'll be hosting Big Data, Big Decisions, Data Centers and West Virginia's Future. This conversation will feature state legislators and officials alongside data center representatives and state advocacy groups. If you can't make the drive to Beckley, we will be streaming this program live, and more information can be found on our website, stubblefieldinstitute.org. So have a wonderful evening, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much.